This episode of Worldview Everlasting is brought to you by the letter Awesome, the numbers Sweet Action, and Issues Etc. Talk radio for the thinking Christian. issuesetc.org.
Hey Internet, welcome to Worldview Everlasting, your favorite YouTube addiction, and on this week's Greek Tuesday, Mark chapter 13, which is all about the end of the world.
I feel fine.
Except when it's not. So you definitely want to
Go for a walk.
So for the next 2 weeks, we've got Mark chapter 13, the beginning and the end, with skipping a section in the middle. What we're going to do this week on Greek Tuesday is overview the entire thing in its structure, picking out those kind of key texts that tell you what's really going on. Next week, we'll come back and we're going to pick up some of the more meaty things that get dropped as asides, right? So the entire thing starts with the setup that Jesus has been in the temple courts arguing with the Pharisees over a whole number of things, but most particularly their love of money. And as he comes out of the temple, one of his disciples says to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what beautiful buildings." And Jesus responds to him. He says, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Now, the result of this is that his disciples later are going to ask Jesus two questions, and their assumption is that these two questions are the same question, which is also the assumption of most Bible readers when they come to this text, and as a result, they misunderstand a lot of this text and think it's about a roadmap to the end of the world, when there's a key text in the text that says it's not about knowing when the end of the world is coming, because you can't know. And the key is going to be then paying attention to, in verse 4, these two questions. They say, "Tell us, Jesus, when will these things be?" That is, when will not any stone be left here, right? "And what will be the sign when all of these things are about to be accomplished?" Which in Matthew's gospel they ask as, "What will be the sign of your coming?" Their two questions then are both, when is the temple going to be destroyed and you return in all of your glory? The thing is, they're assuming that's going to happen at the same time, and it's not going to, especially according to Jesus' answer. And the key to this is going to be him talking about those days and that day. That's going to come up in a minute. But first, we have something to learn about reading the Bible from verse 9. And this is about, what do you do with pronouns in the scriptures? When the scriptures say words like you and I and we, do you assume that it's talking about you, or does the context of the text show you who the you actually is?
Context is everything.
So in verse 9, when Jesus says to his disciples who've asked him these two questions, "You be on your guard, because they will deliver you over to councils, you'll be beaten in synagogues, you'll stand before governors and kings and be witnesses for my sake," does he mean that's going to happen to all Christians, or is he actually telling them that this is going to happen to them specifically? Now, it is true that there are Christians beside the disciples that have experienced these things, but in the context of this section in which he's going to say a bunch of stuff's going to happen before this generation dies, it's kind of hard to then take all of that as being about everyone everywhere. Verse 14 has the same thing going on. Who is he talking to again when he says, "But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be," let the reader understand maybe that I'm not talking to you at all, "then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Now, in terms of preaching and hearing this text in the church this coming week, it will have stopped at verse 13, won't get to verse 14 and that abomination of desolation, nor will it pick it up there next week. It's going to skip over it entirely. We'll try to talk about that a little bit next week, but what's key so far is to know that his answer has been, you disciples are going to have some very specific things happen to you, and when you see a very specific thing, it's time for you to leave Jerusalem.
Run away! Run away! Run away!
Yeah? And this is all happening in what Jesus then says in verse 24 is those days. Those days is a key in the text that he's talking about the time leading up to the destruction of the temple, which he expects his disciples and others living in that era to see coming so that they're not in the temple when the Romans tear it down. So verse 24, it says, "But in those days." Then it goes on to talk about some very apocalyptic kind of things. And we'll talk about apocalyptic language next week as well. Apocalyptic is a style of writing made popular in the intertestamental period and even some of the latter final prophets of the Old Testament, where what they say is not exactly what they mean. They use symbolic language and broad pictures to try to drive home a bigger point. We'll come back to that next week. But again, just don't miss verse 24. He says this in those days things twice, verse 19 and verse 24, and he's going to contrast this with something different, which we'll get to in a minute. But first, in verse 26, there's another thing we can learn about the Bible. It's that when Jesus quotes the Old Testament, he wants you to look it up and see what he's actually talking about. So in verse 26, when Jesus says that they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory, he's actually referencing a text in the book of Daniel. And it's fairly important to know that in the book of Daniel, the Son of Man coming with the clouds is going in a very specific direction, and it's not down, it's up. It's actually Jesus' ascension to the right hand of the Father. That this is what will be seen, him taking all power and glory and might to himself. And his point here is that in doing that, he's going to have the power to make Caesar go tear down the temple, which he has just spent so much time for the last chapter condemning. This is absolutely key. As is then in verse 30, the real center to understanding this text, the next thing he talks about, which is the generation that is before him. He says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth are going to pass away, but my words are not going to pass away." This generation, you disciples who I'm talking to right now, that I've just said all this stuff's going to happen to you, you won't die until the temple is torn down. And I've told you ahead of time, so when it happens, you cannot be there, right? You got to understand that as being the context of this reality. And then as all this language, even the apocalyptic language about the sun turning to darkness, not being about the end of the world, but about first century Judea. It happened in 70 AD. Now, there have been some scholars who've said, well, maybe generation doesn't mean generation. Maybe it's just talking about the Jews. The Jews are still with us, things like that. Yeah, I'm not going to go there with it. He says, you, generation in front of me, the normal meaning of the word, you're not going to die. Heaven and earth will eventually pass away, but what I've just said to you is going to prove itself to be true. Finally, then, in verse 32, we have the shift to talking about the actual end of the world, where Jesus no longer is going to talk about those days, but that day. The answer to the second question, the sign of his coming. Verse 32, he says, "But concerning that day, or even that hour, nobody knows. There are no signs. You can't see it's coming. Not even the angels in heaven know. You don't know the hour of the end of the world, nor can you see that it is coming. It will be like a thief in the night." This entire chapter is a warning that no matter how hard you try, you will never be able to perceive the end of the world before it happens, but it's going to come out of nowhere. And so he closes the whole thing in verse 37 when he says, "What I say to you," right, disciples, "I say to all, stay awake." Right? Whether you're waiting for the destruction of Jerusalem or whether it happened lots of time ago and really doesn't matter anymore, stay awake because the end of the world is coming. And if you forget that, if you start to think that the treasure is here, that this life matters, you're going to be putting your hope into the valley of the shadow of death and missing the resurrection and the life of the world to come, which Jesus has promised he has achieved for us on the cross, which is where he's going to go within a couple of days in the text itself, right? So anyway, next week, come back. We'll try to slow this down and pull out some of the meat. But first we have the structure of Mark chapter 13, a text that is all about the end of the world, except when it's not about the end of the world at all and just about the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Hey, if you like what we do here at Worldview Everlasting, make sure that you like the comment, share the video, and until next time, rock on.